Are you really proud of having done all the questions in the official guide? If so, this video is for you. Hi, I'm Erika. If you've been studying for a while, you know that there are a lot of different GMAT strategies, and many of them are great. You can find videos on some of the best GMAT strategies right here on this channel. However, there are some very popular GMAT strategies that literally do not do what they are supposed to do, and in fact, are often actively harmful. In this video, I'm going to talk about 6 of the most common GMAT strategies that will actually do more to hurt your score than to help it. The first GMAT strategy that does not work is prioritizing the first 5 questions. This has been debunked so many times, and yet it is extremely persistent. If you've been studying for the GMAT for any duration of time, you know how the strategy goes. The GMAT is question adaptive, which means that your performance on each question informs the difficulty of questions later in the section. The algorithm feeds you harder questions as you get questions right, and easier questions as you get questions wrong, until it dials in the correct difficulty level for you, which for most test takers is the difficulty at which you're getting half of the questions right and half of the questions wrong. We can infer from this that the test tends to make bigger swings in difficulty based on questions earlier in the section, with more minor adjustments as the test closes in on your correct difficulty level. Now, some test takers take this to mean that the earliest questions in the section, specifically the first 5, are particularly important to get right, and thus are worth as much time as needed. But this is an overly simplistic view of how the algorithm actually works. When you get a question wrong, the test doesn't immediately drop your difficulty. Instead, it queues up a question later in the section that checks to see if that missed question was a fluke versus an actual gap in knowledge or ability. This means that if you get one of the first 5 questions wrong, you aren't doomed to a low difficulty level and thus a low score. It just means that you have to redeem yourself when your second chance question comes around. But that's not all. The strategy also ignores the importance of time management. Prioritizing the first 5 questions typically means spending extra time on those questions, which means having to make up that time later on. Now, sometimes that all just works out for us, but more often than not, we end up scrambling at the end of a section and getting questions wrong, whether that's because we rush and make mistakes, we guess and we guess wrong, or we run out of time and plain old don't get to answer all of the questions. Regardless of how it happens, getting multiple questions wrong at the end of a section can be devastating to our score, as we have no additional questions to redeem ourselves on. So even if we were able to gain some extra points by investing in the first 5 questions, we'd likely lose them all before the section ended. Moral of the story, this test is designed by experts. Don't cheat yourself out of a good score by trying to beat the system. Just do your best on each question without blowing up your timing strategy. It's that simple. The second strategy that does not work is using the answer choices as hints on Verbal. This is the default test-taking strategy for most people. Read everything on the page before trying to solve. And it kind of makes sense. Process of elimination is a great strategy on Quant, so why wouldn't it be for Verbal? But Verbal answer choices are designed to deceive in a different way than Quant answer choices are. Quant answer choices are largely there to back up a mistake that you've already made. Verbal answer choices are there to make you make a mistake. They present lines of thinking that are convincing if you engage with them, but that aren't likely things you would come up with on your own. Many test takers think they'll know the right answer when they see it, but with more wrong answers than right answers, they're instead more likely to fall into a carefully laid trap. Again, remember that this is a test designed by experts, and those experts are trying to trick you. To get to the right answer, you'll need to avoid several wrong answer traps, so the least we can do is to try to predict our own answers before engaging with them. Now, many test takers are intimidated by predicting because they think they need to come up with the perfect answer, but that really isn't the case. The test rewards even a little bit of predictive effort. Let me know if you'd like a video on how to predict for the different verbal question types. It is an extremely empowering way to take ownership of your verbal performance. The third strategy that does not work is doing quant problems by the book. This one's kind of hard to explain. Here's what happens. In their study leading up to test day, test takers learn 1 or 2 methods to solve a certain type of question. So substitution or elimination for systems of equations, Venn diagrams or double matrices for overlapping sets, exponent rules for exponents, special right triangles rules for special right triangles, etc., etc. Then when they see a question, they identify the question type, and then they solve according to one of the methods that they learned. And that seems right. right? How else are you going to solve a math problem than the way you solve the math problem? But once again, we aren't thinking about the test design. So let's think like the test maker for a minute. What is the point of the quant section? Is it to test whether we know math? No, not really. It's using math as a scaffold to test our critical thinking skills. So would a problem designed to test critical thinking have a straightforward math solution? Maybe at a very low difficulty level, but the majority of quant problems are going to have something more to them, and that something more should shape how we solve the question. So for systems of equations, do we really need to solve with substitution or elimination? Or is the expression we're solving for actually the sum of the two equations? For special right triangles, do we really need our special right triangles rules? Or can we actually solve with less information using interior angles and similar triangles ratios? Is plug and chug less error prone than algebra? Is estimation more efficient than plug and chug? If we approach these problems the standard book-learned way, we may solve too slowly or even fail to solve altogether. But by remembering that the GMAT tests something beyond math, we can approach the problem in a novel way that helps us get the correct answer more of the time and faster. Now, it's important to note that these last two flawed strategies don't just apply to the questions in the quant and verbal sections. They also apply to the quant and verbal style questions in data insights. So if you're working on data insights, you aren't off the hook. Identify whether the question you're working on is more of a quant or verbal style question and let that inform your approach. The fourth strategy that does not work is binging practice questions. Most test takers think that the more practice questions they do, the more prepared they'll be on test day, and they could not be more wrong. In fact, one of my biggest red flags is when a student tells me that they've done all the questions in the official guide, because that tells me that they aren't learning from the questions that they're doing. Think about it with me for a second. If you've done hundreds of questions and you're still making the same mistakes, that means you've effectively been practicing the mistakes. Rather than improving, you've been actively building bad test-taking habits. A better strategy is to practice fewer questions, but to get as much out of each one as possible by reviewing it in depth and committing to never making the same mistake twice. I talk more about the power of review in my 7 mistakes you cannot make if you want a GMAT 735 video, so I highly recommend checking that out if you haven't yet. Strategy that doesn't work number 5, exclusively timed practice. This one is dangerous because it's based in truth. When we study for the GMAT, we want to practice realistically. That's true. We want to use high-quality, realistic practice questions. That's true. And we want to practice with realistic time constraints. A comparable environment to test day, a comparable scratch work setup to test day, and comparable time limits to test day. That's partially true. We want to ensure that some of our practice is realistic to test day, but some test takers take it too far, particularly in regard to time practice. We want to be sure we know how to work around time constraints, yes, but just like working off book, working within a time limit is a higher level skill. It builds on a foundation of just knowing how to solve the problem, which is most effectively learned without time pressure. When test takers practice exclusively with a timer running, they rob themselves of foundational learning, which means that all of the higher level skills they're trying to build are predicated on an extremely shaky footing. And just like with bitching practice questions, that's bad practice, and that builds bad habits. GMAT study instead needs to include both timed and untimed practice, with timed practice building on the skills you learned in the practice you did at your own pace. The 6th and final strategy that does not work is last-minute cramming. This is a funny one because everyone knows you're not supposed to do it, and most people do it anyway. Telling my students not to cram right before the test is most of the time like shouting into the void. Test takers somehow convince themselves that they're an exception to the rule, that they are going to somehow learn faster than is biologically possible, and that somehow mentally and physically exhausting themselves before test day is actually going to make them perform better. And this is the kind of thinking that causes them to perform worse on test day than in practice. I've seen it many, many times. Now, I'm not saying do nothing in the last few days before your exam. Instead, use this time for strategy review using your error log. This ensures that you're going into test day with the things that you've already learned fresh in your mind. And those are 6 GMAT strategies that simply do not work. Now, if you've been led astray by one of these ineffective strategies, no judgment. Many are. But it's not too late for a new approach. Commit to changing strategies now, and you can break any bad habits you've built before test day. Let me know if this video helped you by liking, and subscribe for more videos. I put out new ones every Wednesday, and there are plenty in between from the other experts at Target Test Prep. And if you have questions or suggestions for future videos, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you back here soon.